Blue residue. The rain over the Nebraska plains had no smell. It barely qualified as rain. It only had sound, steady tapping on the metal roof of Joe's diner, patient and indifferent. Wind dragged the noise east toward the interstate, where it dissolved into the larger hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Inside, the air was heavier. It carried reheated broth, old fryer oil, and the residue of cheap tobacco that had soaked into the booths years ago and never left. The neon sign in the window buzzed unevenly. One letter glowed weaker than the rest and stayed that way. Elias sat in the corner booth, where the vinyl had collapsed inward and been repaired with gray tape. The damage leaned him slightly to the left. He had learned to sit with it. In front of him stood a mug of black coffee. It tasted burnt and bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. Beyond the glass, the interstate ran parallel to the diner. Every few minutes a semi slid past, its lights smearing into pale streaks. None slowed. None noticed Joe's. Elias watched them anyway. His hands rested on the table. They were clean for the moment. The darkness around the nails didn't bother leaving. Soap never finished the job. Under the fluorescent light, his knuckles looked older than the rest of him's small cuts, sealed and reopened depending on the week. A burn mark near the thumb from a muffler, touched too quickly. That one had been his fault. Most things weren't. He wore a flannel shirt that smelled of damp cotton and the tire shop rubber, metal, and grease, sharp enough to cut through sleep. Even after a shower, it stayed with him. It had become part of his weather. Without thinking, he pushed the sleeve back. The fabric clung briefly to his skin before letting go. On the inside of his forearm, just below the elbow, a word sat in faded ink. Clara. The letters were no longer black. They had thinned into a bluish gray, their edges softened until the word looked less written than absorbed. More residue than statement. He looked at it the way he looked at his tools after a long shift, not to remember, only to check that it was still there and still not his. He waited for an image. Hair first. There had been a color. He tried one, then another. None held. The effort tightened his forehead briefly and passed. The name remained. Nothing else did. He rubbed his thumb across the ink. The skin felt rough, uneven where the pigment had settled. It did not feel like a memory. It felt like scar tissue present without explanation. More? The voice came from his right, low and level. Sloane stood beside the booth with the coffee pot in her hand. Her name tag was scratched nearly smooth. She poured before he answered. The coffee struck the mug with a hollow sound and settled. Up close, she smelled faintly of damp matches and floor cleaner. Her eyes dropped to his hands. They always did. Hands told the truth faster than mouths. She saw the faded letters and did not react. No pause worth noting. Just the brief acknowledgement people gave to cracks in sidewalks and peeling paint things that belonged to places like this. "You still at the tire shop?" she asked. "Yeah." "Busy?" "Enough," she nodded once. That covered it. She slid a small metal creamer pitcher onto the table and moved on. Her shoes squeaked softly against the floor, a sound that belonged to places cleaned without hope. Elias lifted the mug, drank, and set it down again. The coffee burned his tongue and steadied him. It did what it was meant to do, and nothing more. He reached into his pocket and took out a cigarette. The pack had gone soft from living there. He flicked his lighter once. Nothing. Again, a weak spark. The third time the flame caught. He inhaled. The smoke scratched his throat and pulled him briefly into his body. That was all it promised. This hand had once held someone. He knew that much. The knowledge remained without detail, like something filed away and never reopened. Now the hand tightened bolts, lifted tires, wiped grease. It worked. It didn't remember. He didn't pull the sleeve back down. There was no reason. Instead, he lowered his arm beneath the table and let the shadow take the word. Outside, the rain thinned and stopped. The silence that followed pressed lightly against the windows. Somewhere on the interstate, a truck downshifted, the sound stretching across the flats before fading. Elias stood. His joints protested quietly and then complied. He left a damp dollar bill on the table, too much and not enough, and walked to the door. Sloane glanced up as he opened it. Her mouth moved, maybe to speak, maybe just to breathe. In the end, she only nodded. He nodded back. The air outside was cool and clean in a temporary way. The asphalt in the lot shone under the lights, each puddle reflecting the empty sky. Wind whistled once through a loose panel near the door and stopped. He stood still and listened. Nothing followed him out. High above the highway, the clouds parted for a moment. A pale slice of moon showed through, indifferent and cold. It lit the wet road ahead until the next bend swallowed it. Elias got into his truck and started the engine. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him that asked to be remembered.